Hello, Lewis. How nice to see you. You joined me in my back garden. I am having a scone and a mug of tea. It's not very hot here today, but it is summer, but I've got my jacket on. So, the story. Okay, there were three boys called Laurie, Mark and Nick. They had this great idea that they wanted to go camping. Now, to start with, their mummies and daddies said, oh, you can't do that sort of thing, you're not old enough, you're too young. But Laurie, Mark and Nick kept on at their parents'. They all lived in different houses on the same road. So whenever Laurie was in Mark's house or Nick's house, they would all say, we want to go camping, we want to go camping. And whenever they were in Laurie's house, they would all say, we want to go camping, we want to go camping. You get the picture. In the end, their parents were so fed up with these boys always saying they want to go camping that they agreed that they would let that happen. Now, not far from where they lived, there was a field, and they knew the family who owned the field. So, Laurie's mum phoned up her friend and said, look, my boys would really like to come camping. They've put up tents in their back garden. They're used to putting up tents. They know how to make something to eat. They actually haven't used the camping stove yet, but they do know how to store their food safely so that all the creepy crawlies don't eat it all up. And they're quite sensible. Well, she said that, and then she said, sometimes they're quite sensible. Anyway, in the end, it was agreed that on a Friday night, the boys would pack up all their things in their rucksacks, which they did. And they met up, and it was Nick's mum who went with them. But they said to her, Mum, can you walk behind us, please? They walked off down the road with their rucksacks on. You can imagine how proud they were. And Nick's mum was there, but they wanted to make it look like they were all by themselves. Now, it only took about 15 minutes to get to the field. But when they got there, it was beginning to rain. They hadn't thought about this. They'd assumed it was going to be very, very sunny all of the time. So what they decided to do was very quickly put their tent up. So they threw everything onto the ground, unrolled the tent, and the grass was quite long. They found the poles and put the poles up, and they couldn't find the pegs. The pegs were in the long grass. Well, fortunately, it was Mark who found them in the end. And you know, it wasn't the wrong grass that was the problem. The real problem was somebody put their rucksack on top of it. Not saying anybody's name, Nick, but it wasn't very clever to put your rucksack on top of the pile of pegs, was it? They found the pegs, and they more or less got the tent up, but when they stood back and looked at it, it was a bit wonky. This is where Nick's mum said, well, look, if it's wonky and it rains, you're going to... It was beginning to rain quite a lot by this time, so they put all of their bags inside, and then Nick's mum finished what she was saying. She said, if it's too wonky, then the inner tent will touch the outer tent, and that will let the water in, and we don't want that to happen. So they said, yeah, okay. So they got out again and they stretched it one way and pulled it another way, so it didn't have any wrinkles in it. And yeah, the tent looked really good by that time. But then the boys just took off their wet jackets, because by this time it was really raining. They took their jackets off and they dived inside the tent and they did up the zip. Nick's mum had gone by that time. She was freezing cold and wet. So anyway, the boys just suddenly realised they were there all by themselves. But that was the adventure they wanted, or was it? What happened at night? Were there any nasty animals around? Would somebody come and steal their food? what happens if the batteries in their torch didn't work and it was dark? Or they began to worry. None of them said anything to each other, but you could see, you could just look at Laurie, you could look at Mark, and you could look at Nick, and you just know they were just beginning to think it was a little bit more serious than they'd realised. We're going to have a bite of school. So, they decided that rather than think about things, they would sort out their food. So they unzipped a little bit of the outer tent. Oh, I'm sitting in the garden, it's a bit sneezy out here. And they stretched a hand out, found the bag of food, pulled it back in, and zipped up the tent again, just to keep themselves dry. Well, they started looking in the food bag, and they couldn't quite work out what to start with. So, in fact, they were chattering for quite a lot until the pitter-patter of the rain on the outside of the tent had gone. So they decided, I'll tell you what, we'll go outside and sort out the food. So they did. They undid the zip, and sure enough, all of the grass was very wet, but it wasn't raining anymore. And they'd got a spare ground sheet. That was a really good plan. That had been Mark's idea, and I think we have to give him credit for thinking about bringing along a spare ground sheet, because they were able to put that out on the floor, and then they could sit on it and actually put the food. Now, they hadn't got a stove, because one thing that the parents had said is you've got to be very careful with burning yourself. So take some food along that you can eat, even if it's cold. Well, I don't know if you know this, but Laurie quite likes cold baked beans. Mark doesn't, and Nick doesn't, but they didn't want to say. So Laurie said, "Oh, we'll have cold baked beans." He started opening the tin. It was one of those pouring things, and started pouring out the cold baked beans into everybody's plate. Well, do you know what? It was so, they were all so hungry by this time that it turned out that all three of them actually liked cold baked beans. They found some bread, and they found some butter, but the butter was absolutely rock solid hard because it was so cold. So they couldn't spread the butter on the bread, so they just ate the bread by itself with the beans. And then they had some fruit, and there were some oranges, and those satsumari ones, you know, those little small ones, and they had a couple of bananas, and they were still hungry, so they had an apple each as well. And then they remembered chocolate, and sure enough, they had got a bar of chocolate. So they opened that up, and there was a bit of an argument because it didn't break down equally into 3 equal bits, and Mark was saying, well, it was my idea to bring the chocolate, so I should have the extra row. And then Nick said, hang on, we're a team together. Laurie said, if one person has chocolate, everybody else has the same. Well, they agreed to it in the end, so that's what they did. And then they thought they'd just go out and do a bit of exploring. So they went for a walk around the fields, and they could see into the next field where there were some sheep, actually. And in the field after that, there were some cows. But by this time, it was beginning to get a bit dark. So they thought they'd better go back to the tent and find their torches. Well, the worst thing that you can imagine is happening is that Mark's torch isn't working. It worked when he set off, but when he'd packed it, he'd made the mistake of pushing the on button on, so it had been turned on in his rucksack for the last day because he packed his bag the night before. So he got no torch. But anyway, the others said that they would share with him, but he was a bit scared, because what if he wanted to go to the loo in the night? Would he be able to find the other people's torches to borrow? So he started going, oh, I don't know. So they agreed that they would all put their torches near to where their heads were, and that anybody could borrow anybody else's torch, and that seemed like a better thing to do. So they then said, well, at home we wash, but we haven't got our mummies and daddies here, so we're going to go to bed without washing. They got their sleeping bags out, and they did take off their dirty wet clothes because they didn't want to be wet in bed. And one after another they slithered into their sleeping bags. And once they were all in their sleeping bags, by that time it was dark. It was really dark, and nobody could see what was going on really. So they put their torches on, and then they did that thing where you put the torch onto the top of the tent, and then you use your hand to make little different types of animals, and you had to guess which animal it was that the other person was actually making. And they gave you a hint by making a noise, you know. Actually, you needed the hints because some of the animals weren't very easy to work out at all. And they were noisy, and people coming past on the road could hear all of this noise and all these flashing lights inside the tent. They wondered what was going on. All of a sudden, 10 o'clock, all of the noise stopped. All three of them were exhausted. And what happened the next day is a different story. Good luck, Lewis!